My role is as head of impact and sustainable investing, and I'm responsible for the product under this strategy as well as thought leadership. Why biodiversity is important? Well, it's pretty simple. We depend on it for everything. The air that we breathe, our food, our water, our medicines. 63% of medicines come from plants. But we have a problem, and the problem is that in the last 50 years, we have decimated biodiversity globally. Impact investing without a quantifiable outcome is not impact investing. We only invest in companies where we can prove in a quantifiable way the delivery of positive impact outcomes.
Hello, Ingrid. Thanks for coming on the show. You're in London now, but you grew up in Croatia. So tell me, what was your early life there like?
Morning, Scott. Thank you for having me. My early life was wonderful, spent between seaside and the countryside. I think it also shaped my interest in sustainability. I used to spend a lot of time with my grandparents, one of whom was really into conservation, animal conservation. His hobby was a forest ranger at the weekend, so I used to trek the forests with him. And my grandma used to save all the animals in the neighborhood that need saving.
I guess with this exposure that you got, you became a walking encyclopedia when it came to plants and animals.
Yes, but I used to be a walking encyclopedia. Yeah, I could, concoct a plant tea for any ailment you had.
So this early connection to nature is when you came up with the solution to the planetary crisis?
Not then, but it definitely made me appreciate how nature is important for us. And later on, when I started, so my career started at Lazard, where I was a sell-side analyst, initially looking at emerging markets and then moving to wider Europe space. And then when I started my career on the buy side, I was covering EMEA. So I had the pleasure of visiting, various mines, extractive industries around Africa, Russia. And one thing that struck me was not only the grayness of the places itself, but of people and nature around it. And that's something that really shaped, with my childhood, my interest in sustainability. I also used to surf a lot, and I would go to this so-called eco paradises, which turned out to actually be plastic paradises. So it was a combination of, my hobbies, my childhood, and my career that shaped my interest in sustainability.
You had this very idyllic childhood in nature, but as you got a bit older, while many of your contemporaries may have been playing with toys, already then you had a penchant for doing deals.
Yeah, I always had the entrepreneurial spirit from a young age. I set up a library at home. I had many, many books. And I used to lend them out. I had a little library, and, you either had to give me a candy or a chewing gum or a chocolate if you wanted to have any of my books. And I had a ledger where I kept everything proper. So, yeah, it started at an early age. I was like 9 or 10 then.
That certainly says something. And then when you were 14 years old, you moved to London. Now, I presume your family moved there and you didn't decide that you're going. And you've been based there ever since. So how did it come about that your family moved to London?
It was my father's work. So we all moved to London, and I was based there with a couple of stints in Italy whilst I was studying. And then I moved to the States for a couple of years as well for my work.
What was your father doing?
Something very unsustainable. He worked in the oil industry. He was a CEO of an oil company.
Did that influence also you later on?
Not really, because I didn't see the position that he had. I didn't get to know all the negative things about it at the time in terms of extractives, etc. It was afterwards when I actually, as a part of my job, started visiting that I realized how negative it was for our environment, not just from emissions point of view, but from biodiversity as well.
I guess that leads to some uncomfortable conversations at Christmas time.
Well, the conversation at Christmas time goes like, Dad, I don't drink water from plastic bottle. And the answer is, well, you don't have to, but we'll never get rid of plastics. So that's I have my dad. Yeah. Yeah, it's cheap and it's convenient.
So you moved to London. Where did you go to school?
So I went to college in London called MPW, and after that I studied at University College London, also known as UCL, and I read Italian and business studies, and I was kind of toying between history of art and / economics, languages, and I think my father's advice was sound that I can always pursue my passion for the arts as a hobby, and I better get a proper degree.
I understand you studied both business and Italian there.
Italian was my second language. So in Croatia, I grew up 45 minutes away from Italy. So I studied Italian. And when we moved to the UK, I also started studying Spanish as well.
So that's where the Italian came in. Did you grow up speaking Italian in the house?
From the age of 6, yeah.
That gets you through UCL. And then you told me that your career choices were shaped by your father and Gordon Gekko. Of course, that refers to the fictional insider trader character of the movie Wall Street that was loosely based on Ivan Boesky. And in 1997, you started your career at Lazard, which you already referred to. And I believe you joined there as an equity research analyst. So did you find there that greed is good?
Yeah, kind of. I think Gordon Gekko shaped many from my generation into, wanting to work in finance. And to be honest, it used to be a lot of fun in those early days, 20 years ago, a bit different from today. So I have to say, definitely in the early days, I did experience, the finance fast lane. It wasn't, let's say, regulated as it is today. No, I shouldn't say that.
You're raising an interesting point. Why do you say it was a lot of fun? And you said that with, I could see it was a lot of fun. How do you contrast with today? Does that mean it's not as much fun today?
You had arbitrage in the market, which is difficult to come by today. So that made it more interesting. You could go and see a company and, speak to the management, do your research, and make some assumptions that necessarily were not splashed out already all over the news because, the speed, the quantity of data that we have today. So it was much more hands-on. I think today it's probably, especially if you look at the public markets, the arbitrage has been or is very quickly disappearing. I mean, that's also clear from the performance of the hedge funds that we've seen over the last 5 years. Majority of the flows are driven by CTAs, and then, passives seem to be roaring ahead and overtaking actives. And just by the sheer fact of that, the arbitrage is disappearing. And then the market concentration and all the rest that we know about.
What you were doing at Lazard, because you came in as an analyst, but I think later on you were leading big IPOs there. So how did your progression go?
So I was hired to cover emerging markets. At the time, Lazard was one of the houses that had big business in emerging markets, especially in Eastern Europe, which started with the debt side. So I was hired to do equity side. And given that I spoke Italian and Spanish, after a couple of years, I was transferred to do Europe as well. And that's where I got to do the big IPOs of the time, which were Inditex in the retail space, Burberry's in the luxury goods space. And it was great. You know, it was really being thrown at the deep end, and it was like sink or swim. Like I issued my first research report after 4 months of joining.
And then somehow in 2003, you moved back to Croatia to do a brief stint at Teva Pharmaceuticals in Zagreb. That's quite a different change. So tell me how that move came about, which I guess didn't last a long time, right?
No, so they were actually a client of ours. And it was this, I think, yearning of kind of, oh, I want to go back home. My grandfather at the time, he was getting old. I was very close to him. But it didn't last long because I didn't find it very intellectually stimulating. So after 6 months, I decided to go back to London and work on the buy side, which was my plan initially, had it not been for my grandpa's illness, because I figured out those are the guys that have all the fun. You know, we go to them, we work 24 hours a day, and they get to pick the stocks and, you know, look at all these different sectors. So that's how it happened.
And you've been having fun ever since. Huh?
Fun ever since, yeah. Fun ever since.
So then 2004, you moved back to London, and for quite a good long run, almost 9.5 years at Jupiter Asset Management. And I think you went straight into co-managing a global managed fund and their flagship EMEA fund. So how did that all come about?
The EMEA fund already had a number of holdings that I was covering before. So it was quite an easy move for me to do. And afterwards, a couple of years after that, I started co-managing the global, what we call the Global Managed Fund, which was co-managed by different teams across the floor with their input.
These were equities?
They're always equities, yes. Always, yeah. They were all equities.
Were these absolute return funds? What did sustainability or impact play any role in your allocations there?
So actually, well, sustainability as a term at the time didn't even exist as such in finance. But the Global Managed Fund, I started managing it, that portion of the fund from what today would be described as almost exclusionary basis, because I had a huge underweight to oil and gas sectors and mining sectors, which at the time were for EMEA markets, what, you know, the Magnificent Seven today are for the global markets. You had a really big concentration in those sectors. So I had big underweight there, and I was quite choosy in terms of, you know, which companies to allocate to, and was looking really for companies that had, you know, at least decent governance and, you know, were not as big polluters as some of the others.
So you already started to drive your allocations with some element of a qualitative aspect to it, huh?
Exactly, yeah. Yeah.
And then I guess just to note, while you were there, you were included in Citywire's first ever global compilation of the 1,000 top fund managers in the world. So that must have been kind of a heady thing relatively early in your career, huh?
It was nice. It wasn't heady. I mean, I think what was interesting that there were at the time so few women that were included in that compilation. I think that was a big eye opener. Until I saw that, I wasn't aware how few women were actually, you know, involved in the business. It was a nice recognition than anything else. Yeah.
And then I guess around 2014, you landed at PDM Capital. So tell me how your time at Jupiter came to an end and what drove your move to PDM.
So we did a management buyout whilst I was at Jupiter Asset Management. And I always felt that the missing part for me was getting the US expertise, because US is such an important market. So I had an opportunity to go and work with a family office in the US, and I jumped on it so that I would get the expertise in the US market. And that coincided in 2015 with the launch of the UN SDGs. And that's when really my journey in impact investing started in earnest. So that was interesting. I actually worked on a buyout of an impact shop, which was probably 5 years too early in its existence at the time, which was based in LA. It wasn't successful, unfortunately. I think today probably it would have been very successful.
Most people have heard of Federated Hermes. It's a huge global asset management firm, but there may be listeners who are not familiar with it. So maybe you can just give a high level overview of Federated Hermes. And then I want to drill down on impact and sustainable part of the business. So maybe you can kind of talk about that and then drill down on your current roles and strategies and funds there. And I guess I really want to know also how impact and sustainability investing fits in overall at Federated Hermes.
So it's a US, UK based asset manager. The headquarters are in Pittsburgh. We have about 770 billion of assets under management. But in addition, we also advise through our stewardship service on 1.8 trillion of assets, where we engage with businesses and we set agendas in terms of environmental, social, governance, KPIs. And we engage on behalf of global pension funds, endowments, charities. So in terms of what we do, London is kind of the hub for sustainable and impact investing. And that's where the expertise lies, in the Hermes part of the business, which is known as the leader in responsible investing. They've actually invented what today is known as stewardship and coined the word engagement to explain to investors what it means to engage with a company for better outcomes. My role is as head of impact and sustainable investing, and I'm responsible for the product under this strategy as well as thought leadership. So if you look at London, I mean, all of our assets have, whether you want to call it ESG integration or sustainability considerations, that are on the fixed income, equity, private market side. And the same goes for the US, especially for the fixed income business, where we have 100 billion in AUM.
So you're primarily working on public debt and equities?
Yes. I look at the public markets.
I found somewhere that you are the portfolio manager on the Federated Hermes Biodiversity Equity Strategy. Is that true?
So it's a fund that was launched in March 2022. And it is the first biodiversity champions fund in the equity space. And what I mean by this is, when we started looking at the space, the first thought was a transition fund, but then you realize that literally every company on the planet needs to transition. So what we decided to do is find those companies that are actually already focusing on biodiversity, the so-called biodiversity champions. And we put two main criteria into place to identify those businesses. The first one is that the business needs to align to at least one UN SDG. And the reason for this is that 80% of the UN SDGs depend on biodiversity. So as you probably know, we keep on reading about it's only 5 years away to 2030 goals on UN SDGs, but we've only achieved less than 20%. Well, one of the main reasons is that you do need biodiversity to be taken into account. And the second one is that the company needs to help preserve or restore biodiversity. So if you look at the global market cap, which is almost 9,000 companies, which is, the usual MSCI all world benchmark against which we get benchmark, we found about 150 companies that are biodiversity champions. So that's not that many, frankly speaking. Obviously we apply exclusion lists to that companies that are really taking biodiversity into account, either as a part of their risk management, so supply chains, or as a part of their strategic decisions, are far and few in between. But thanks to the TNFD, we are seeing this change. Everybody was looking for some sort of guidance. And, we are hopeful that this positive trajectory in terms of adoption of TNFD is going to continue.
Did I understand you correctly that all of the strategies have some responsible investment angle and sustainability angle to it?
Everything at the shop has some angle to it. It's to varying degrees. So, the strategies that are directly under my umbrella obviously have a very high bar. So if you look at the impact strategy, that's really the highest bar that you can have. It's almost an approach of patient capital investor. We only invest in companies where we can prove in a quantifiable way the delivery of positive impact outcomes. We also take into account double materiality for each one of our businesses. Then we have a sustainable fund, which, brings together three types of companies, the so-called ESG leaders, the impactful businesses, but also companies that are improvers, where we tend to engage a lot. Then you have the biodiversity champions, which are really the champions. And then, if I look on our fixed income side, all of the products have some sort, if not quantitative, at least qualitative sustainability screens that are applied to them. Our real estate business on the private side does the same. Our infrastructure business and our PE business does the same. So for PE, climate change is something that is very important, but they also take into account a number of other ESG factors. Our real estate business is actually coming out. So they already have a whole so-called code of conduct for the companies that they work with, and they will be coming out with their comprehensive biodiversity strategy this year. So to varying degrees, every single vertical within the company has sustainability as a part of the investment process.
You mentioned primarily 4 major asset classes. Could you ballpark the approximate allocation between public equities, public debt, private equity, private debt, what the split is roughly?
I mean, if you take out the money market business, the split is about 50% fixed income, and then 40% equity and 10% on the private side.
What about the target returns?
I mean, we don't have a target return. We're trying to outperform the benchmark, which obviously if you look at overall sustainable space, has been quite challenging over the last couple of years, because not only for sustainable, for many strategies, they don't have exposure to the Magnificent Seven, given the narrowness of the market and, such a high concentration of returns in 7 or 5 stock, depending on the quarter. But what we are trying to achieve is deliver positive outcomes for the planet, be it society or the environment, in addition to financial returns. And our view is that over the long term, the companies that we invest in will outperform, because they're providing goods and services which are satisfying the most critical needs, again, being of the environment, of the society, and they're exposed to secular and scalable sources of growth.
Are your investors primarily institutional and qualified professional investors, or do you have anything that's accessible retail?
No, it's accessible retail as well. So institutional and wholesale.
What is Federated Hermes' theory of change for impact and sustainable investing. I know from speaking with your colleague, Mitch Resnick, on the fixed income side, that sustainability is very much integrated in almost all that Federated Hermes does, and that it's taken seriously.
So in terms of the theory of change, I think what's key for us is being able to prove theory of change, the positive outcomes that we are looking for. And in most of the cases, we believe that in order, and this comes really to impact investing more than sustainable investing, impact investing without a quantifiable outcome is not impact investing. So to that end, we have actually set up a proprietary impact database where we track every one of our holdings on an annual basis. So for instance, we have 23 KPIs. We look both at operations and solutions. Those KPIs are actually covering what we believe are the most critical E, S, and G factors. And, I'm glad to say that we have 4 years of positive delta for for actually all of our businesses. I mean, maybe there was some, small changes, but that was mostly due to COVID effect. And why this is important is that, we have full accountability and traceability for our investments. We can really prove that we are channeling capital to the businesses that are creating this theory of change, be it for the environment or with regards to society in the provision of their goods and services.
You're primarily focused on public equity markets. And a lot of people I speak with ask me about how can buying and selling publicly traded equities or bonds on the secondary markets, how does that impact investing when you're on the secondary market?
A lot of people ask me the same question, Scott. And the take is quite simple. I mean, if you're thinking about, how many dollars in terms of impact you get for your investment in the private space, it's quite easy to quantify. And there is this, the secondary market. But think of it this way. So every successful private company has an end goal, and that end goal is usually to do an IPO. So the way that I see it is we act as providers of permanent capital for those impactful businesses to grow. Second thing is, if you look at the access to capital, obviously in the public space, it's much larger than it is in the private space just by the sheer size of the markets. And in order to grow that positive impact, you need that capital. So I think we play an extremely important role in scaling up the positive impact in the market that goes beyond, just purely looking, well, what are you doing? It's, buying and selling shares. Well, it's not.
Let's talk a bit now about how you operationally integrate sustainability and impact factors across your different strategies into your investment analysis and decision-making processes across the various different strategies that you have.
I think the best example to give you perhaps is on the dedicated strategies, because that's where we have a very high bar. The other strategies will use qualitative and quantitative screens, and then we have engagement, which is super important. So we engage with corporates as a part of our stewardship service, but we also have dedicated engagers on the team. And that's also, part of the theory of change, to drive change through engaging with businesses for the positive outcomes. So let me give you one example of how we look at the themes that we invest in. So for instance, for our impact strategy, which really is the highest bar in terms of investment, we have identified 9 themes that are in alignment with the UN SDGs, which we believe really cover the most pressing needs of the society and the environment. So, it's food security, it's health and well-being, education, financial inclusion, future mobility, something that we call impact enablers, which are companies that are actually, enabling other businesses to be very impactful, circular economy and water. And if we take health and well-being, that's SDG 3, a very important SDG. It's a combination of thematic and impact investing, which is driven by us identifying what we believe are the long-term mega trends. So if you look at health and well-being, we have identified something that we call persistent pandemics. And those are the likes of non-communicable diseases, which account on average for 70% of the global death every year. And within those, chronic diseases have the highest incidence. And within the chronic diseases, diabetes, also known as the silent killer, accounts for almost 11% of global deaths every year. So what we look to do is get direct and indirect exposure to the theme. In terms of the direct exposure, the big problem with diabetes is that today you have over 500 million people that are suffering from diabetes globally. This number is expected to grow to in excess of 700 million in the next 30 years. The cost is already high. Just the direct cost today is more than $1 trillion per year. If you actually add the indirect cost to that, you can increase this by 30%. And one of the main reasons for the high incidence of mortality is the lack of a proper measurement and proper medication. So what we've done is we invested in a medtech company called Dexcom, and they're a leader in continuous glucose monitoring systems. And what CGM does, it gives you 24-hour monitoring of your glucose levels. So, majority of the planet still today measures their glucose levels by pricking their finger with a needle. That's inaccurate and untimely. And this is the reason why, you don't take insulin time and you have issues. So CGM gives you 24-hour monitoring. But, talking about the impact, positive impact, this is a company that's increased their sales from 100 million, less than 100 million, actually, 10 years ago to 3.5 billion today. And they've done this with only reaching 2.5 million patients. If you think of the global, obviously it's not, more than 500 million today. They actually say that their TAM is about 50 million people. But they have managed to not only improve the lives of diabetic patients, because what CGM allows you is to literally have a normal life. It's a sensor that tells you, when you're high or you're low, you should administer insulin. It also reduces the cost of diabetic patients considerably. So if you look at the United States, the average cost of a diabetic patient per annum is about $16,500. And through the use of CGM, you can reduce this depending on, your co-payment, etc., on your insurance scheme by about $5,000. So it's not only that they're helping to improve people's lives, they're also helping to reduce the healthcare budget so this money can be used, elsewhere. So very impactful business. Once we kind of establish a direct link to our chosen theme, we start looking at, what are the indirect factors that are contributing to that particular theme. And in terms of NCDs, there's always this view that, majority of them are genetic. Actually, they're not. Genes account for only 20%, and all the rest depends on your lifestyle, what kind of food you eat, how active you are, what kind of environment you live in. So to that end, we have invested in a company that is the US-based business that is democratizing access to gyms. We are also looking at, finding, which has been a bit challenging, businesses that are providing access to healthy foods or promoting that. So it's a very interesting space.
Your website says that your responsible investment strategies, you cover a full range of asset classes, and each of these asset classes have their own investment style and stewardship approach. Can you describe like what are the key similarities and the key differences and the key challenges when you integrate your approach into these different asset classes? And then I might add that you're doing all this while still generating or trying to generate traditional financial returns in line with investor expectations.
So if we talk about what I said earlier, if you're running a concentrated fund and your remit really is whether it's impact sustainable investment, we go to a really granular level in terms of what we are looking for. In terms of investment, like our KPIs, the number of KPIs, 120. So the overlay is going to be more of a screen-based overlay as well as qualitative, which will be at the discretion of the manager. So I think the main difference that you have is between the type of the product, how concentrated it is, how it's not. And then if you take emerging markets, for them, obviously, a big focus is engagement with the companies, given that they are behind in terms of, versus the developed world and in terms of, ESG, let's call them the ESG considerations. So you will have different levels of integration depending on the product.
To make it real, walk me through the end-to-end investment process when you're making an investment in one of your portfolios. Maybe you could pick one and talk through it, and what's your investment horizon, and then what are your financial and non-financial screens, or qualitative versus quantitative?
Again, if we talk about the impact product, because that's really the highest bar, we take the approach of a patient capital investor, and we're trying to capitalize on what we see as mispricing of the long-term change in the market. And this is that these businesses are not being priced correctly given future development, what we expect to be the future development of their revenues and their markets in terms of the total addressable market. And this will be driven either by the actual needs, whether it's in the climate space, everything that we're seeing around natural disasters, whether it's in the health space, in terms of the demand, the aging population, the obese population, prevalence of, on the financial inclusion side, the prevalence of, the need for financial inclusion globally. What we do is we have what I mentioned earlier, the database. So we have to be able to prove in a quantifiable way that this business is has intentionality, actually wants to do impactful things for the environment, for the society. And the second one is obviously that what we are looking for is what is this business doing that is additional, that wouldn't exist otherwise. So what is their contribution? After that, we start looking at the financial factors of the businesses as well. And if you would describe the similar characteristics of our businesses, what you will usually find is that they're monopolies or oligopolies, or are leaders in a fragmented market, which they're actually consolidating. So very strong market positions. What we look for is usually that, we don't like very capital intensive businesses. So asset light, a growth both in terms of organic sales, maintenance of margins or increase in margins. We look at the ROIC to WACC spread, high free cash flow generation. So those would be some of the financial considerations that we take in place. And then in terms of the actual valuation, given that we see ourselves as long-term investors. So when we think about business, we're like, are we comfortable owning this for the next 3 years with a view of, how do we think this will shape out in the next 5 years? So we run DCF for each one of our businesses. And, we look at the best, base, and worst case scenario. And we are quite conservative in terms of the terminal growth rates that we apply to the businesses. So this is how our investment process shapes up.
So Federated Hermes invests from both a best-in-class but also from a transition perspective. How does your investment allocation process differ between these two concepts?
So if you look at the transition, that is the part of those portfolios are really looking to engage with businesses and help them improve their transition. So it's very hands-on in terms of, communicating with the companies, setting targets, monitoring those targets, sharing what we believe are the best practices. We have a very, very extensive engagement framework. So that would be the main difference. So the business is what's interesting. So if you look at the impact fund in terms of the engagement for us, environment is less than 10% because these businesses are so advanced in terms of, where they are on the transition scale. And then with improvers, the environmental part, the E part is going to be much higher than the S or the G part.
Are there key KPIs that you track to ensure that your impact performance is in line with the expectations you had from a sustainability perspective?
So if you look at, for instance, on the environmental side, what we look for, obviously, it's the emissions, it's water, it's waste. For specific industries, we'll also look at food waste that they help to avoid. Then for pharma companies, we'll be looking at, number of patient lives saved. On the S side, we'll look at the usual, the breakdown, the board composition, the number of minorities that are employed. On biodiversity, we'll be looking for how much land company has helped preserve from conversion, given that land conversion is one of the biggest problems that we have today, given that 50% of land on this planet is already used for agriculture. So we are constantly losing our natural carbon sinks due to conversion. And it's not a very efficient conversion. So we track a number of KPIs. Do you want me to tell you all of the KPIs?
Well, it depends. If there's 65 of them, no. But if there's like key ones that you want to say, it could be instructive.
So I can give you some key ones. So, the annulus metric tons of CO2 emitted, megawatts of renewable capacity installed. Then we look at how much water a company has used and how much it has saved. We look at waste generated, but also waste recycled. So what I was saying earlier, everything is based on double materiality because we like to net out the effect. We look at employee turnover, the number of incidents. We look at, R&D as a percentage of sales. We look at, number of people that have been given access to nutritious food. What I said earlier, the hectares of land that a company has helped to restore or preserve. So those are some of the KPIs that we look at.
So do you believe you can demonstrate or have demonstrated perhaps that active management of sustainability risk outperforms the market over the long term?
If you're looking against the benchmark, that's a great question. We've gone through a very unusual period, which started with COVID, then the inflation and the biggest rotation in the markets that we've seen in the last 50 years, coupled with the biggest interest rates. So it hasn't been a very easy market to operate on. And if you look at our businesses, they are growth businesses, quality growth businesses. And that's something that's been sold off in favor of value. And the second thing that happened was this prevalence of 7 stocks, the Magnificent Seven, which have been driving the market, which is not necessarily the names that you would see in an impact or more in an impact portfolio because they wouldn't pass the threshold. So it's been difficult, but we believe that over the long term and, provided that the markets normalize, if you're looking on the benchmark, we should outperform given the type of the businesses that we invest in. And what's quite interesting is when you see a sort of a normalization in the market, which, in the recent times has been mostly driven by the move in the yields, this type of products tend to outperform substantially.
Impact is all about having impact. How are you measuring the targeted impact of your different portfolios post-investment from both investment return and sustainability impact? Is that primarily with these KPIs, or is there a bigger process behind that?
It's the database that we have, which we track on an annual basis. It's updated on an annual basis. And what we look for, obviously, is positive delta in terms of impact generation.
Your website says that many of your teams perform their own fundamental responsible investment research through proprietary tools, as well as using these tools to make investment allocation. Can you talk me through Federated Hermes proprietary data tools that have been developed and give me an overview and maybe an idea of what do they actually do? Because that would effectively be a competitive advantage for you in the market if they're all proprietary.
We have a number of proprietary tools. The first one that I would point out is so-called QESG, which combines data from various sources as well as our own proprietary data, which has been generated over a number of years through engagement. And what it produces is something called environmental tool, which can show you how every portfolio is performing in terms of KPIs such as emissions, such as waste, such as water, such as renewable electricity versus the benchmark. So that's very useful because you can see where you are versus the benchmark. Second one is the one that I really like. It's called Planetrix. And Planetrix allows you to run climate scenarios under different temperature assumptions. And what it gives you, it actually allows you to see, what's your value at risk in terms of climate, in terms of your portfolios. And that comes really handy because, we could look at individual companies and then engage with the companies and tell them, we have concerns because, we don't think that your climate change targets are sufficient enough for you to, continue being a resilient company. We have a number of other tools which are being developed at the moment, which I'm very excited about from our US team, which are really going to go into a granular level in terms of the various sector exposures to the main risks, which we can also be able to use in terms of our portfolios and the analysis, mainly on the risk side.
How do you use this, or how does it work in practice? Are you basing all of your decisions primarily on the outputs here in your decision-making process?
So we can use these tools to run screens. We can put the parameters that we are looking for. And, we'll get a list of companies that are investable according to what, the parameters that we put in place. That's the first thing. The second thing is that, especially for the transition portfolios, you can actually speak to a company and have a full breakdown of both the physical and the transition risk in terms of climate and see whether that's viable. That can also inform, whether the projections that the company has put out in terms of targets are viable, whether we believe their capex is sufficient, insufficient. Then from the biodiversity side, we use Biodiversity Intactness Index, which is from the Natural History Museum in London, that shows you the intactness of over 100 locations, 100 countries and 58,000 locations globally, which gives you quite a good view of where the supply chains are at risk, whether it's from natural disasters, whether it's from regulation and policy, because we look at regulation and policy very much. We think that's something that is key in shaping the sustainable agenda, whether it's the EU deforestation policy, whether it's the CSDDD, the global biodiversity framework. And we think that that's something that actually is going to be a very positive tailwind for the type of the businesses that we invest in. So there are a number of screens that we can use.
All of these tools depend on the data going in. Corporate reporting on metrics beyond carbon is limited. So how do you manage to ensure accuracy of your conclusions? How do you protect and develop this additional data that you have to feed into these various tools?
So it's quite demanding in terms of man hours because we do it ourselves for our purest portfolios. We engage with companies. We are using with some data providers that we rate very highly and that we believe have done the granular work, which is required. But a fair bit of it is done by us internally. If you're looking for granular level, if you really want to do deep dive analysis, you have to do it in-house.
Let's discuss how Federated Hermes approaches engagement versus exclusion. You've already mentioned that Hermes came up with the term stewardship originally. What is the role of stewardship in your mind to achieve targeted outcomes, from both an investment return and a sustainability impact perspective?
I think it's key in order to drive positive change. That would be the first thing. You need to engage with companies for a couple of reasons, apart from the positive change, is actually to share the best practices that are in the market, to hold them accountable, the management, to their targets, and actually to put forward, what, we believe. And that's usually objective. It's not subjective stuff, what they should be aiming for as best practices in the market. We annually engage with more than 2,000 businesses across different sectors. We also do a lot of thought leadership, whether it's on all the pertinent issues, whether it's plastics, whether it's water stewardship, biodiversity. We also have a framework. There is one thing about engagement that, there's this view that engagement is something that happens over a short term. It's not over a short term. It takes years, and the average engagement period is, 4 years with different milestones. We believe in engaging rather than divesting, because the issue with divesting is, well, what have you really achieved? If you divest, you haven't changed anything, and there is no, a positive outcome for anyone there. And probably, I think what's key is that you can hold companies accountable when you engage with them. And if you engage on, a quite sizable amount of assets, as we do, which is 1.8 trillion, we can help influence positive outcomes for our investors, but also for the society overall. So in terms of the exclusions, we have regular exclusions that many other houses have, such as weapons, tobacco, adult entertainment, or nothing out of the ordinary, so to say.
Let's say you were engaged over a period of 4 years. At what point would you look to divest from an active investment opportunity that was not working out as you expected?
So we have milestones that are being monitored, and we would probably divest at the end of the period. We would give a grace period, obviously, if the milestones are not met. But I have to say that in many instances, we've seen positive progress. We haven't had many instances where that has been the case. And obviously, also the work that the team there has been doing has been phenomenal in terms of, setting targets, engaging.
Could you give me a real example of an engagement activity that drove impact and influenced returns?
So we were worried about a certain healthcare company that their products are, being misused, missold for unapproved labels, and copycat products, which were actually harmful to people, seriously harmful to people. So we engaged with this company and we were asking them, what they're doing to reverse this, what kind of powers they have within the company to actually remove the fraudulent product from the marketplace, what they're doing in terms of physicians' education on off-label prescriptions. And this was actually a short engagement, which was led directly by the impact team. We talked at about a year, and the outcome was that in their capital markets day, the CEO spoke about the heightened governance brought about these issues and that the improvements that they were bringing forward. And we know that the number of fraudulent products has been taken out of the marketplace, because that was not down to the company, that was actually down to the regulator as well as, to the law enforcement. And we know that in terms of we've actually seen firsthand outcomes that in terms of the, off-label prescriptions, those have been reduced immensely.
You are very active in the biodiversity space. And as we already discussed briefly, you're the portfolio manager for the Federated Hermes Biodiversity Equity Strategy. Is this the area where you see the most scope for impact and return currently? Also, where does biodiversity fit in at Federated Hermes?
So it's been a focus for us for the last 5 years, actually 4 years. We came out with a white paper called Our Commitment to Nature, where we have explained what our expectations from the corporates are. We have been very active both on the policy side and on various industry-led initiatives such as Finance for Biodiversity and a Nature Action 100. We cooperate a lot on biodiversity within the industry. And why biodiversity is important? Well, it's pretty simple. We depend on it for everything, whether it's the air that we breathe, our food, our water, our medicine. 63% of medicines come from plants. But we have a problem. And the problem is that in the last 50 years, we have decimated biodiversity globally. And there are only 2 reasons for that. And one reason is our consumption needs. The second reason is our energy needs. We have behaved very responsibly in that we have taken nature as something that is permanent, but nature is not permanent. It's just another resource. So the way that, you should be thinking about nature is the same way that you think about, copper, iron ore, all of the resources that are scarce. So we think that it is the biggest or one of the biggest systemic risks that we are facing globally in the next 10 years. On the other side, not enough attention has been paid to it to date. And what we have found is that companies are not taking it into account routinely, either as a part of their strategic decisions or as a part of their risk management. And we think that the repercussions of that will be huge, because the number of risks that we are carrying, on as a corporate is, whether you will be stranded with stranded assets or you will not be able to get permitting for your projects, all of which turn into financial, the reputational risk on the supply chain side that, we read about on a daily basis. And then there are economic risks that are, the price of food, the persistent inflation that will come out of it, the geopolitical considerations, given that the expectation is that 50% of all the food will come from outside the country of origin in the next 20 years. So it's an extremely important subject for us.
Your Biodiversity Equity Fund was created 2.5 years ago. What is the interest in it, and what's the AUM of this after a couple of years of operation?
The AUM is just under 50 million now. It's a emerging asset class. If you look at the AUM in biodiversity space, they've increased 6x over the last 5 years, but it's still very small. The funds have only started to be launched over 2 years, over the last couple of years. And actually, if you look at, the interest from asset allocators, that's something that has been emerging since COP15, which was a year and a half ago. And there has been a very long educational process around biodiversity and, what's the best way to approach it and, what are the investable themes around it. So it's a very young asset class.
You're an expert member of the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits. Explain the biodiversity credit market would look like and how can it work?
It's early days in terms of biodiversity credits, but it's something that is very necessary, whether you're thinking about conservation or whether you're thinking about restoration. What we're trying to deal now is deal with the issues around it, and the issues being, when it comes to the carbon market, you have a single metric. Here you have a number of metrics. And the second thing that you have is ecosystem. Ecosystems are localized. So you have to think of how to apply that on a global scale as well. You have to think about a number of different issues, how to make it, tradable and scalable, which is important. And those also include, the buyer-seller relationship, how that will look like, the actual permanence of the project itself, likes of, natural disasters that can affect the project and indirectly the credit applied to the project. So there is a lot to consider, but, we are hoping that we will come out with some sound principles on how to develop this market later on in the year.
What's the major obstacle?
Single unit, and that it's localized. When it comes to the carbon market, it's a single unit and it's the same globally. Biodiversity is local and there are, millions of units that need to be considered.
Ingrid, I've got a few last rapid fire questions to wrap up our talk here. So just give me whatever comes to your mind, or if nothing does, feel free to take a pass. If you had to name the single most important challenge in the impact and sustainable investment space at this point in time, what would it be and why?
The biggest risk really is the concentration of the market and, a number of stocks being disregarded because of that. And the fact that not enough money is being channeled.
Why do you think biodiversity is so important?
Because we don't have enough resources to feed the growing population. We are at 8 billion, expected to reach 10 to 12 billion in the next 20 years. And as the Gupta review pointed out, we would need today, at this standard of living, 1.6 extra Earths to satisfy our consumption and energy needs. And as far as I know from Bezos and from Musk, they haven't found those 1.6 Earths in the space yet. So yeah, we've got to deal with what we have here.
Can you describe an investment that you were skeptical of either at the time you invested or maybe you ultimately passed on it because you didn't think it ticked your impact sustainability boxes, and in the end it turned out way better than you thought and you were pleased you invested? Or if you had passed, maybe you wish you hadn't, and what did you learn from that experience?
An investment that ticked all the boxes and really is promising in terms of how they can transform positively the healthcare industry. And, it was probably one of my favorite companies in the portfolio. It still is. But the problem with it is that the market turned and the company, despite having pretty good financials, pretty good outlook because of the flows in the market that are geared towards the large caps, has not performed as well. And the lesson learned from this is that the market has considerably changed and you actually do need to take into account these big pools of capital today and how that is affecting the market.
If someone wants to get into the impact and sustainability space, how would you advise them to get into the business?
What I always advise all the people that I mentor, start on the equity research side, because that gives you such a good foundation to move anywhere from there. And obviously focus on the sectors that are pertinent to this class. So, healthcare, circular economy, that's what I would advise.
Ingrid, you've been very generous with your time. I think we've gotten to the finish line here. I've really enjoyed it. And it was great talking to you. And thanks for taking me through all this. I appreciate it. I've learned an awful lot. Tell everyone your websites and social media and all that good stuff.
I'm on LinkedIn, and our website is Federated Hermes, where they can find more information about our work.
And what's the best way for people to contact you?
Via LinkedIn.
Ingrid, thanks again.
Thank you, Scott, for having me. Thank you.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.
You've been listening to SRI 360. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe to get future episodes. You can find an archive of all previous podcast interviews and more articles and information on SRI, ESG, impact investing, sustainable investing, and socially responsible investing at our website, sri360.com. If you'd like to read more lessons learned from world-class SRI investors, get a copy of Scott Arnell's book, Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360. It's a must-read for anyone wanting to know more about investing for positive social, environmental, and ethical impact, all with market financial returns. These are the stories and tactics of those leading the way as sustainable and responsible investing goes mainstream. Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360 is now available in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook format wherever books are sold.